Morning, everybody. This is Zach Said It Again. I'm your host, Zach Cooley, and it's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Stephen Dinero, who is the executive director of the Edith Bolling Wilson Birthplace Museum in Wytheville, of which I am honored to be on the board of directors. Stephen, thank you so much for talking with me this morning and allowing me to be a part of your board. That's a great honor for me.
Well, thank you.
Now, we are going to talk about some things. Ever since the Edith Bolling Wilson Museum was open, I had hoped and championed and campaigned for it to be a fully handicapped accessible museum, simply because I believe that things that are seen by any tourist should be seen by all tourists. And everything I run into as I travel locally and around the country, there are so many things that I'm not allowed to see because I am wheelchair bound, and many historical places are protected by being historical buildings. You can't add things to them. I kind of think that's a bit of baloney, because how could you harm a historical building by putting a few pieces of plywood or a metal ramp to the side so a patron that wants to see the building can come in? I remember when they did a film to campaign for wheelchair access into the bottom part of the museum, and I was a part of that film, and we were able to get the grant to get the ramp so that I could get in even to the bottom part of the museum.
Right.
So that was a big moment for me, and I was honored to be a part of that. But there's some wonderful things that you're doing now in terms of the museum and making it accessible for all people, particularly with the hearing impaired. You recently did a wonderful new exhibit, Edith in Context, which places her at the early 20th century and the socioeconomic impact that was going on at that time, and it was a very wonderful exhibit, and I was allowed to take part in that and hear it via audio, and some of the things that you've done for hearing impaired to make that accessible. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Well, Zach, maybe I should give a little bit of background on all of this to sort of give a little bit of context of what we're trying to do here, because it's a big task, and you're making a really good point, is that through your travels, when you go to various sites, whether it's through, it might be the National Park Service or a historic site, a building, whatever. It is not, even in the 21st century. I mean, here we are several years after the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, thanks to Senator Dole, and in large part thanks to Senator Dole. And
that was 35 years ago, by the way.
Exactly. I mean, you probably know the details far better than I do. And here we are all these years later, and I have done a bit of traveling throughout the U.S. and abroad, and I will say two things. On the one hand, the good news, we are leagues beyond other countries, for example, and other places. We are amazing. This country is amazing when it comes to looking out for and trying to be accommodating and inclusive when it comes to people with differences and so forth. I mean, we're amazing. It's awesome. The bad news, we've got a long way to go yet. And as you pointed out, I mean, even if you go to, let's say, larger, I'm coming from Philadelphia. I lived there nearly 30 years. Some of the larger museums, even a place like Philly or New York City and so forth, only very recently do you see some of these institutions They're making efforts, but more often than not, it's expensive. And you put your finger on it, especially if it's a historic building. How do you grandfather, these things are grandfathered in. So how do you put in an elevator, let's say, or put in various, means through which to create accommodations? It can be expensive. It can be, it's intrusive. I know the campus I used to work on, there were these old mansions where they didn't want to, damage the appearance of the place and so forth. And so they were grandfathered in, and as a result, they didn't make changes. And this was, of course, problematic for people with differences, disabilities, even someone who might have injured themselves. They broke their leg skiing or something, and there they were with crutches or whatever, and they didn't have accessibility to the building. So we've got a ways to go still, and I don't know that it'll ever be perfect when it comes to providing accessibility for people with physical or other differences. But here at the Edith Bolling Wilson Birthplace Museum, since I've been here these last couple of years, I had been thinking about these kinds of issues when my previous position in Wyoming, I came here from Wyoming a couple of years ago, ran a museum out there, and we had started and worked on a few small projects, but nothing really, we really never got moving, I'll be honest with you. Once I got here, I thought, you know what, with a little bit of support, and most of our support has come from With Bland Foundation, as well as some others. We've gotten two grants, 2024, 2025 grants from With Bland. But I want to start out by saying that, my introduction here will also be my conclusion, which is these approaches need not be super expensive. If you use technology, you can, and that's what we're trying to do here at the museum. Finding ways, an elevator, of course, is expensive. Things like that are expensive. But can you use technologies? And you've pointed out with, you already mentioned with our most recent exhibit, the Edith in Context exhibit, we're trying to use technologies, things like QR codes, things you would never imagine, using technologies in order to help provide accessibility. And it's cheaper in a way, it's more innovative in a way. We're not the first to do this, let me be clear. We're just taking advantage of some of these new opportunities that are out there. And because we are small and we are in a smaller community, and so this is what we're working on, and I can give some examples if your listeners want to hear about it.
Yes, absolutely. Give examples on that.
Well, let me begin by, really there's a couple of things to talk about. Mm-hmm. Technologies allow you to overcome geography as well as differences. So let me be clear that some of what we are doing is simply, and it's not so simple, but we are trying to overcome geography. What do I mean by that? Increasingly, and again, some of this I did start in Wyoming, so I'm tapping into some of what I did out there, but improving upon it now here that we're here in Southwest Virginia, using our website, using social media to access folks who will never actually physically visit our site in Whitville. So, for example, we're going to be creating our very first, but not last, hopefully, virtual exhibit will be on our website in the not-too-distant future. We're shooting for sometime in January of the coming year. We did this out west. We'll do it here. So people, for example, wherever you are in the world, needless to say, can access our website. And the exhibit that you mentioned, the Edith in Context exhibit, it won't be identical to the exhibit we have physically located here in the museum, but it will be very close to that exhibit, and people can begin to see virtual exhibits. Again, the large museums in bigger cities, if you go to a website like the Met or the Art Museum in Philly or any of those kinds of large museums, they've had virtual exhibits now for some years. So increasingly we're going to try to overcome geography, if you will, by putting more and more of our materials on our website and on social media, Facebook, etc., to make our materials more accessible to people who, for whatever reason, cannot or will not come to our physical location. So that's the first thing, overcoming geography, if that resonates, if that But then the second part of this, of course, is what our topic is today, which is trying to bridge gaps with people who have differences. And here, as you've already, pointed out in your introduction, we're talking about people with perhaps certain hearing impairments, visual impairments, or physical challenges. As you mentioned, that might, of course, even obviously include yourself being in a wheelchair. So I'll start with the hearing impairments. Some of these things are really not so extraordinary. Closed captioning is something that we've introduced here at the museum just in the last year. And that's, a lot of people really appreciate having closed captioning, even people who feel that their hearing isn't so bad, but just being able to read as you present a material that, sometimes you miss a word or something, you misunderstand. And certainly as we all get older, all of us, our hearing may be starting to decline. And we also have some materials we purchased from a company out in Salt Lake, so that anyone who might come to Salt Lake City, anyone who might come to the museum whose hearing is, if you're totally deaf, then our materials don't work for these technologies. But someone who has low hearing, just hard of hearing, we have systems that we've purchased that can help as we walk around the museum. We will guide you around the museum, but these technologies we've purchased from the folks out in Salt Lake City. It's a company that specializes in this kind of area. It will amplify our voices. It will amplify the materials, any of the audios that we have here in the museum, to allow people to better hear. As I say, if you're totally deaf, then these materials, of course, these systems don't work. So there's one area is working with hearing impaired, again, using technologies. As you mentioned, we also have then what we call Scan to Listen. This is something that we've developed here at the museum. This is for visually impaired. And basically what this is this is something we developed here on site because we looked at, there's a lot of systems out there, and they are a bit pricey for helping people with low vision, blindness, and so forth. And we do have a consultant from Radford who's been helping us with developing some of this. Long term, we are looking at even developing, possibly using 3D printing some models that we might have here in the museum. But this is a long-term goal. We don't have any of this in so that people could hold. For example, just as an example, some people who are listening may be familiar with the fact that Mrs. Wilson drove an electric car. She was the first woman in Washington, D.C. in the early 1900s to have a car. We're imagining creating a 3D printed electric car, so people who can't envision, because they don't have the ability to see what the car looked like, could feel what the car looked like by printing and creating one of these cars, or more than one possibly. But in the meantime, our Scan to Listen system, what that is that we're like the Edith in Context exhibit. You can listen to all of our exhibits. Now, we aren't there yet, but we are slowly building a system whereby you will be able to scan each exhibit and hear what it says if you can't read what it says. And that's what you had mentioned at the beginning of the show. And then lastly, again, last but not least, of course, is anyone with physical challenges. You yourself may want to talk a little bit about what I sent you earlier this week, or last week, our virtual guided tour of the Bolling home, which is on the second floor of this building. Anyone who comes to this building has to go up 20 very steep stairs. Even people who are not in, say, a wheelchair or with a walker or whatever, may find those stairs very challenging. And so they stay downstairs and don't go up and see where the First Lady was born. So I sent you that virtual guided tour. We're going to be creating more of those, but you may want to talk a little bit about what did you think of that guided tour. I think that may be a possibility for people. We're going to be putting that guided tour on our website, but basically it's not the same as being in the Bolling home, but it's maybe the next best thing, that's a tongue twister, is to allow people to see what the Bolling home looks like until we do have maybe an elevator someday.
Well, I will say this, that I have written for the paper since 2005. I've been involved with writing and doing some PR work for the Edith Bolling Wilson Museum since around, my earliest guess would be 2008, which would make 17 years. And ever since that first moment, I have been championing for a way for an eventual elevator or whatever it would take for wheelchair patrons to be able to see the entire home, because it is a rule for me that if I can't see it and experience it, then I'm not going to promote it and tell people to come and see it if I can't see it and give an honest review myself. So my work has been to champion to eliminate these barriers ever since then. So when I saw that virtual tour, it was a very moving experience. You had Shane Terry's voice guiding you through those rooms, and something that I have been asking Whitville or whomever to allow me to see for the last 17 years, and I am finally able to see it. And
good. That's a vote of confidence right there.
That was very moving for me. And two things that I wanted to mention from the virtual tour. Well, one thing in particular that I think especially ties in with what we're talking about today, and that's that Grandmother Bolling had difficulties as she advanced in years, moving around. And
right, she herself, you're correct. Yes, she herself had mobility issues, and she had to be literally carried at times because she was, to get up and down those stairs. Yes, you're correct.
But a famous quote from her is that Edith said, her grandma always said, "I hate and I can't." Mm-hmm. And that has always been something sort of that has been, I guess, maybe a mantra of mine, to be told simply, "You cannot see this," because of something I cannot control or something I certainly did not choose. That is something that has always been completely unacceptable to me. So the fact that Grandmother Bolling says I can't, maybe her willing spirit is guiding us to break down these barriers to make this museum accessible. And yes,
and she refused to give up. She refused to give in, and it was, you cannot help but wonder. Despite she did have some kind of, from what we understand, she had some limitations herself in terms of mobility and so forth. She was an older lady, and yet she instilled in her granddaughter, who becomes the First Lady of the U.S., she says, "You will not accept, I will not accept, I can't. You can and you will do whatever is set before you. You will not accept that a barrier or a limitation." Absolutely, Zach, I agree.
And and therefore I shall not either. I was born with cerebral palsy. Will be 40 years ago in March. I was given a 10% chance of survival when I was born. They told my mother I would be blind, deaf, or mentally retarded, most likely all three. 10% chance of survival at all, and I'm still here, and I haven't hit any of those predictions yet. So, I've lived in Whitville all of my 40 years, and I love the history around this town, and I would like to see all things like the Trinkle Mansion, the Rock House. I would like to see all of these things accessible, and I appreciate the fact that the Edith Bolling Wilson Foundation cares enough to make these changes, and the fact that that the ultimate goal is it will take many grants, many donors, many sponsors, probably many hundreds of thousands of dollars of renovations, but it is a goal to have an eventual elevator so that I would be able to physically see the upstairs. And something that really caught my eye and ear during the virtual tour was that Judge Bolling read Charles Dickens to Edith and her siblings every year. I read a Christmas Carol to my wife and daughter every year. So I thought, wouldn't it be a wonderful idea to have, when we do get everything all accessible, to have someone dressed as Judge Bolling and perhaps do a reading of A Christmas Carol during the holiday season.
Absolutely. The possibilities, I would totally agree with you, and the possibilities are huge and always, growing, and this is the exciting aspect of this sort of work. But just to back up for a second,
sure.
I would absolutely agree that we hope to serve as a model for others, locally and beyond, that again, more often than not, when it comes to these kinds of things, people say, I'd like to do X and such, but it's just too expensive. And I want to reemphasize that, yes, things like elevators and so forth are very, very expensive. There's no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. And making changes to historic buildings and so forth, there are all kinds of limitations. All of this is true. But the beauty nowadays, and everybody knows, it is a very rare instance nowadays when you don't find people, and I've worked with people all over the place, and let me tell you, this one thing we all have in common nowadays is people reach into their pocket and pull out a phone. We all are connected in terms of our use and access to technology of various types. And these technologies are so empowering. And so it's not just the youth, it's not just the young kids. Sometimes we say, the kids, they're just sitting around playing games. Well, some of them may be, and some of us occasionally play games too on those phones.
Exactly.
But in the meantime, that phone has power, and these technologies have power to raise us all and overcome differences and overcome boundaries and barriers, and we should take advantage of those opportunities.
It is the same as they say the internet is a dangerous place. It can be a dangerous place, and it can be a wonderful place, depending on how it is used. Anything could be used for subversive or unwelcome behavior, shall we say. And anything can be used for improvement and encouragement and education and edification. It's just
exactly, and I hope that the takeaway that people come away here is that the power of these tools, especially, as I say, for people, older people, people with differences, you name it, people of different cultures. I can just tell you, we're using these technologies when we have people coming in. Sometimes people who do not speak English. We are using these technologies literally every day. It is just extraordinary. It's virtually impossible. Excuse the pun. It's virtually impossible to keep up with the opportunities that are out there. So yes, these are exciting times.
Well, there are two things that I want to say to you, and I will say them when the microphone is on, and I will say them when the microphone is off. I want to thank you and the board for an opportunity to, most boards will look at me and see that, I'm a liability, or I may not be able to get out and attend the meetings, but when that's the case, I can, if I don't have a driver per se, I can attend meetings virtually. So I want to say, first of all, thank you for the opportunity for allowing me to serve on this board and to give my input, not as just a disabled person, but as someone who loves and cares about the history of this community. But most of all, thank you for caring enough to want to make these changes for disabled patrons of this museums and of this museum and museums everywhere, because what it takes, every museum in the world could be handicapped accessible if it takes the right people in the right places to care enough to make it such. So the reason that these things are happening and are in the works of happening is because someone in the right position cares enough to make them happen. So in that instance, I am eternally indebted to you, Dr. Dinero, for your devotion to this cause.
Well, thank you, Zach. And I just, from my perspective, this is, I just think this is, it's common sense to include as many people at the table. I mean, why there's never a reason to exclude anyone. Everyone is always welcome at the literal and figurative table. I welcome everyone to this museum. I welcome everyone into my, again, speaking both literally and figuratively, I welcome everyone into my personal and professional life. I try not to see barriers and boundaries, though, that's not always possible, obviously, but this is how I've tried to live my life, and it's not always easy, but those barriers are out there. We know they're there. They've been there, and slowly but surely, again, hopefully we can do our part to remove them as best as we can, and if each of us play a part, I don't see why we need to have divisions. Ideally, if not, if we can, let's knock them down if we can. So that's just where I'm coming from. So I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you about these issues, Zach. It's an ongoing conversation, needless to say.
It is.
This is an ongoing project, but I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today. And needless to say, you are very valued on our board, and your input as a person, not as a disabled person, as a person, and that's who we all are. Let's start as being, people first, and then whatever ideas we bring to the table because of our various backgrounds and experiences, all the better, of course. But we start as people. So I appreciate this opportunity today, and of course welcome any and all to come to the museum, either virtually or in person, and to see the kind of work we're working on.
Well, it's been an honor to speak with you and to talk about this. And again, it's easiest for people who own museums to say, well, as long as we let in the people who have the deepest pockets, we don't have to let everybody in because the law doesn't require it. But if we look at it from a standpoint of we're all people and we all should be included, then there's no reason there should be any limitations.
Well, there are higher laws than the law of the land. Let's be clear.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for talking with me today. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, thank you, and I wish everyone good and happy holidays.
Thank you very much.